Order. This is the October 28th Select Board meeting of the tax classification hearing. And we will open with Michael Blay giving his presentation, and there will be slides included.
There it is. Do you want me to start?
Please.
Good evening, everybody. So as we gather here, this is the annual tax classification hearing for fiscal year 2025. This is the step that precedes or is has to happen before our tax rate is set. We have actually submitted all the forms for the tax rate. This is the final step before we send everything to the DOR. So I'm just going to go through with basically what it says up there. The first thing that the selectmen will be voting on is keeping a residential factor of 1 or shifting the percentage for the tax rates, where it would be split up into 2 rates, one for the residential class and the other for the commercial, industrial, and personal property. And so that basically what they're voting on is if you keep a residential factor of 1, we're keeping a single tax rate, which is what we have historically had in the town of Stockbridge. That is also what the Board of Assessors recommends for fiscal year 25. Right now, or actually, before I announce what we're considering the tax rate to be, the Select Board can decide to shift the tax rate up to 150%. If you do the shift, again, it will create a residential factor that cannot create a residential factor that is lower than the town's historic factor. And actually, on page 3, did you want me to move around with that, Mike? Or
We have a copy of that, Michael, a copy of this.
yeah, this is all of this was sent to the board.
I know by email, but did we print out copies of this, Michael, or no? That's all right. I can follow.
Yeah, I thought there should be.
It's usually in the packet on the desk, but.
This. I think we should put it in here, but it was moved over to here.
Okay, so on this page, basically what this is the breakdown of the classification tax allocation for fiscal year 2025. Group 2, actually group 1 shows the LA4 values for all the classes that we have, which is the residential, commercial, industrial, personal property, and the total of 1,352,842,058. That is our total tax valuation that we have. That does not include the exempt properties. Group 2 is actually the percentages that each one of those class bear for the total levy. And you can see it adds up to 100%. So right now, the residential percentage is 90.7693. There is no open space that was moved into residential, decades ago. The commercial percentage is 4.6986. The industrial percentage is 0.4848. The personal property percentage is 4.0473. It'll give you a total of 100%. That just is showing you the percentage of the fair and full cash values and what they represent in our total levy. What we're proposing, if the tax rate is to remain with a residential factor of 1 with no split to the commercial, industrial, personal property, would be a tax rate of $7.09 per 1,000 evaluation. That is an overall decrease of 28 cents over last year's tax rate of $7.37. That is the first item that the Select Board will be voting on. The second item, there are actually 2 options that have to have a separate vote. The first is the option to allow a residential exemption. And at this point, the Select Board has the option to vote in an exemption up to 35%. And I'm just gonna go through, Mike, did you want to skip to page 6? Okay. I'm gonna go through how this is calculated, and what I'm using is for the first group, 20% of an adoption, and then I'm using a high of 35%. So the residential exemption is one of 3 options that may be adopted by the Board of Selectmen during the tax classification process before setting the town's tax rate. If adopted, the residential exemption may be up to 35% of the average assessed value of all residential properties. That does not mean the average single family valuation. This is the average for the entire residential class. A residential exemption applies to every residential property which is the principal residence of a taxpayer. The residential exemption does not apply to accessory land incidental to a residential use, second homes, or to residential property not occupied by its owner. This would include rental properties. In addition, the application of the exemption may not reduce the taxable value of the property to less than 10% of its full and fair cash value. And in the following section is the actual calculation that we, if approved, would submit to the Department of Revenue. This is actually pulled from their online gateway system that we use for submitting our valuations and our tax rate. Everything is automated through a system that's online. So I'm just going to quickly go through the calculation of the residential exemption. Initially, what we have to do is divide the total assessed valuation of just the residential class, and that's the 1,227,000,000, by the total residential parcel count. Again, this is the total residential count, not the single family count. That comes up with a average residential value of 723,184. Next, what we do, and this is where the 20% comes in, that average residential value is multiplied by the percentage that is chosen or adopted to give you the actual amount, which is 144,637, that would come off of every actual value that is, I like to use the word vetted, because we would have to go through a process of determining the exact number of properties that would be eligible for this exemption. Once we have that number, well, let me just skip over to the next part. In order to apply the exemption, it must be determined which parcels are eligible. I have estimated the eligible parcels to be around 662 right at this moment. And again, that process of determining and getting to that number is very difficult. There's an easy system set up at the moment prior to an adoption of the residential exemption where we can easily vet the entire tax rolls and come up with an actual number. The Department of Revenue will be looking for an actual number if this were to be adopted. But right now, we have to have something to present for this presentation and have an idea of what that average residential exemption amount coming off of each eligible parcel would be. As I state here, it's a very rough estimate, seeing that the determination of residency is more involved than just looking at the mailing address on the property owner's tax bill. Because there's a requirement in town to have a PO box in order to get your mail delivery, it makes it that more difficult because having a PO box in the town of Stockbridge doesn't necessarily mean you vote here, and it doesn't necessarily mean that your property is not a second home. So page 7. So the actual number of 144,637 is multiplied by the eligible parcels, which again is an estimate of 662, to determine how much value is taken from the total residential class and dispersed to the second homeowners and renters who would not qualify for the exemption.
Renters don't pay tax.
What's that?
Renters do not pay tax.
No, this being like an owner of a second home.
You said renters, and I just want to clarify, landlord.
Right, yes, it's the actual owner of the property. This total is 95,749,694. Now, that isn't a loss in tax levy, that is a shifting of that amount within the tax levy. And by doing this, you create a new tax rate for the residential class that is calculated. This tax rate will be higher than the open space, commercial, industrial, and personal property classes if maintaining a residential factor of 1. The new residential tax rate using the above numbers, again, all estimates, would be recalculated to $769 instead of the $709 that's being proposed. It would be an overall increase in the tax rate of 32 cents from fiscal year 2024 to fiscal year 2025. And I've made some notes down below. Again, I don't think it's a mystery as to how this works. Only the owners of property that are residents of Stockbridge through a vetting process will get the possible benefit of the residential exemption. It's still possible that an individual's property tax could increase even after the residential exemption if the fiscal year 2025 assessment has increased above the normal percentage increase or their assessment is or at what is considered the breaking point. This is especially true for fiscal year 2025 since the real estate valuations have increased again and significantly due to the sales that took place in calendar year 2023, which were mostly higher than the adjusted valuations from fiscal year 2024. There are currently no cities or towns in Western Massachusetts that have adopted a residential exemption. The adoption of this exemption is, again, basically a shift in the tax burden. We are not actually raising any additional money with this shift. And to the property owners who have rental property, it creates an automatic split tax rate in communities that may have no intention of having a separate residential and commercial rates. Now, the second part of this is basically the same thing. It's just using the maximum of 35%. So I'm not going to go through all the notes. I'm just going to skip to the calculation of the residential exemption. You're still using the total assessed value. You're still dividing it by the same number of parcels and coming up with the average of residential value of 723,184. But you're going to be multiplying that by 35% to come up with a higher residential exemption of 253,114. And again, that would be the amount that comes off of every eligible parcel after we have vetted the entire tax rolls. So we're still going to use the 662 parcels for this study, but we're going to multiply instead of using the lower amount, 20%, it's going to be the 253,114 times 662 to give you the total amount, which would be 167,561,460. Again, you're not eliminating this amount, you're making up for it through a different revised tax rate that you normally would have if you weren't doing a residential exemption. The new tax rate using the 253,114 coming off of every eligible parcel would be recalculated to $8.21. This would be an increase of $1.12 over the rate that is being estimated at $709 for fiscal year 2025. It would be an overall increase in the tax rate of 84 cents from fiscal year 2024 to fiscal year 2025. That is basically the residential exemption. The third and final option that the select board will be voting on is the small commercial exemption, which is on page 10. So the small commercial exemption is one of 3 options that may be adopted. If adopted, the small commercial exemption may be up to 10% of the assessed value of each eligible Class 3 commercial property. A small commercial exemption applies to Class 3 commercial properties that are occupied by businesses with an average employment of no more than 10 people and an assessed valuation of less than $1 million. A small commercial exemption is not allowed for commercial properties that have any current vacancies. I just want to make it clear that I believe last year I didn't make that clear about the vacancies. Any businesses that have, or any commercial properties that have any kind of vacancy are not eligible for the commercial exemption. For a business to qualify, the director of the Department of Workforce Development must certify that it had an average annual employment of 10 or fewer people at all locations during the preceding calendar year. A list is provided to the Board of Assessors on an annual basis for those that, and we actually use that list to come up with this presentation. Adopting a small commercial exemption increases the commercial and industrial tax rates. The amount of the tax levy paid by those two classes remains the same, but because of the exempted value, it is distributed over less assessed value. The higher tax rate creates a shift that reduces the taxes paid by the owners of properties occupied by small businesses and shifts them to larger commercial and industrial taxpayers. The calculation of the that is a typo. That is actually the commercial total class evaluation is $3,515,600. So if you were to adopt a 10% or up to a 10%, I'm just going to use 10% in the presentation, you would get $350,560, which is the total value to be exempted from every eligible commercial property. The total value to be exempt is subtracted from the commercial and industrial class total. So in the example, the 70,122,200, you take away the total value to come up with, and that is the total levy, 69,770,640 remaining in the valuation by class. In order to apply the exemption, it must be determined which parcels are eligible. I have gone through the list that was provided by the Director of Department of Workforce Development. And for this year, we've determined that there would be 6 parcels within the community that would be eligible for the small commercial exemption. A new tax rate for the commercial class and industrial class is then calculated. This tax rate will be higher than the residential and personal property tax rate. The new commercial, page 11. The new commercial and industrial tax using the above numbers would be recalculated to $7.13. This would be an increase of 4 cents over the rate that is being estimated at $7.09 for fiscal year 25 if adopting a residential factor and keeping it at 1. And just some notes on the small commercial exemption. The small commercial exemption would have a very small impact on those parcels that are eligible, even using the highest 10% exemption amount allowed by law. The reduction in taxes does not go back to the small businesses. It could if that is what the property owner wanted to do. It basically benefits the owner of the commercial property. The adoption of this exemption is basically a shift in the tax burden to larger commercial and industrial properties in town. It creates an automatic split tax rate in communities, again, that may have no intention of having a separate residential and commercial rate. And I did make a note down at the bottom that last year for fiscal year 24, the Board of Selectmen did choose to adopt a 10% small commercial exemption for fiscal year 2024. The results of that adoption were minimum. At that point, we had 9 commercial properties that were eligible. I believe when I presented the tax classification, we presented 8. But once you start vetting the commercial properties as well, and start looking to see who has vacancies and who doesn't have vacancies, that number can fluctuate. So we ended up reporting 9 commercial parcels to the DOR with the 10%. The maximum reduction in value for the highest eligible parcel was $99,950, with the minimum reduction in valuation being $38,420. The resulting savings in taxes on the highest reduction of $99,950 was $686.40, with the resulting savings in taxes on the lowest reduction in valuation of $38,420 being $285.46. So it wasn't a big change in the tax amounts for the eligible commercial properties. We were able to enact it. It was something new for us because we hadn't done it before. But the savings, because again, this only goes to the properties that have 0 vacancies for the entire calendar year, really is not that ample as far as the actual commercial amount goes. I just did want to, it's not in the presentation, but I have the LA4, the final LA4 that we would be submitting to the DOR. And I just wanted to mention the total values that it's not very specific in the presentation, that right now our total real and personal taxable property value, now this is valuation, is $1,352,842,058. The total exempt property is $170,237,700. We have a total parcel count with real and personal of 2,714 accounts. And that would be it for my presentation.
Thank you, Michael Blay. So at this time, the select board can ask Michael questions or clarifications. Chuck, do you have any questions? Patrick?
I have a few. Michael, this is my 5th tax classification hearing, almost exactly 4 years. It's my recollection that the residential class had a total valuation of 880 million in my first year. And this year is at 1.227 million, which is a jump of $350 million or 40%. So that means that we've seen a $350 million increase in wealth amongst the folks who own property in this town in my 4 years on this board. And that's based on assessed values, not on what actual properties sell for. Is it your experience the properties sell for more or less than their assessed value in this town?
No, that increase in valuation is solely based on
Assessed values,
the sales.
sales.
Yes, absolutely. I've been putting in the town report, not trying to get too much into it, but it's not a mystery that everyone's valuations in many communities, if not every state, have gone up because of the sale prices. We have no control over that. We get the deeds, we look at what people are paying for their properties. We don't care if it's a cash sale. I know that's been a big article in the papers lately. I mean, it is what it is. Our job is to look at the deeds, determine whether or not that is an arm's length sale and adjust accordingly. So the assessed values are an end result of sale prices.
My point is that those of us who own property in this town are doing pretty good. In 4 years, you've seen a 40% increase.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, valuations are
Through the roof.
a good thing. I mean,
I'm not complaining.
exactly.
I'm one of them.
No one wants to be under mortgage.
And just so that the public understands, when you say the estimated levy, that's the amount that we actually raise in taxes from.
Yes, I actually have that number. So we are looking at for
9.5 million.
9,591,000 is the amount that is on our recap that we would be submitting to the DOR for what we're raising in the overall taxation.
And just so the point I'm just making is that we raised $9.5 million and we've seen a $350 million increase in wealth. That's simply the point.
Oh, and when our valuations went over $1 billion in the total, I had to do a double take to make sure that our system wasn't spitting out a number that wasn't there. I mean, it is quite amazing that based on, that we're over $1 billion in valuation on, 2,000 plus.
And I have two more questions.
That's reality.
You've given us two examples in this, which is at the 20 and 35%. But the fact is that legally, the select board can choose any number if we were to go for either a commercial shift or a residential exemption shift. We can choose any number between
You can't go higher
10% to 35 and up to 150 for the commercial class.
Yep.
So there's a lot of.
You mean for shifting?
For shift.
Yes, for shifting the rate.
So basically, you've given us a couple examples, but this board could decide, for example, to do no shift or to do a compromise shift or to go at the maximum allowable shift.
Right, I mean, the Board of Assessors, when I say recommend, historically that we've always had a single tax rate, we have such a low commercial base, we have less than 10%, that shifting a burden to a class that doesn't really, shouldn't and can't absorb that, I mean,
And
we
what's
don't have a big commercial base here, we're never going to have a big commercial.
and what's
base
the
here.
lowest residential exemption shift we could make? It's 10% if I'm correct, right?
You can go up to 150%.
Lowest. No, not for the residential exemption.
Oh, for the residential tax
Yeah,
exemption?
I believe the lowest is 10% and the highest is 35%.
Yes.
Correct?
I believe so.
And one last question. You mentioned that no communities in Western Massachusetts have adopted the residential exemption to date. That's correct?
I believe so. I think that's, Mike, right? That still holds up.
Yeah, I'm not aware of.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any. There might be some that didn't have their classification hearings yet, but I'm not
Mhm.
familiar with where they're going with that.
And yet in the Affordable Homes Act, the legislature and the governor accepted a proposal by Senator Julian Sear to allow seasonal communities to increase the residential exemption to 50%. And they went out of their way to include Western Massachusetts, specifically Berkshire County seasonal communities in that increase from 35 to 50% if we were to accept the designation, which Stockbridge will be offered the designation because of the percentage of non-primary residents.
And-
Do you have any theories as to why they've increased that percentage from 35 to 50%?
I have no idea.
No.
I really don't, honestly. I mean, that is something that they went ahead and from whatever decided, I don't know where the actual studies go because there's nothing that they can come up with out here, seeing that it hasn't been means tested at any community, on this end of the state. So, I mean, I don't know where their numbers came from. I'm not privy to that at this moment. I mean, I know it's fairly new. So there might be something coming out from the DOR, either through an IGR or a bulletin, but I haven't seen anything come across our desk that even,
Okay.
And
That's all my
something
questions.
that is that alarm, that big of a difference.
Thank you, Patrick. So, and just information, the seasonal communities has to go to town vote and it's a zoning change. It's not a valuation change. Am I correct?
For what Patrick just
Yes.
mentioned.
It's a
Yes.
designation.
Also, Michael, can you just remind people what the tax rate is currently and what it would go to if it's a single?
The tax rate is $7.37 right now. The commercial rate is $7.43 right now. That's because of the small commercial exemption. It did change it last year. And we're proposing $7.09. And I'm not saying that is in.
Yeah.
That could change because we still would have about a week or two where we're dealing with the DOR and them looking over all of our financials and everything we've submitted for basically a year in progress to get the tax rate set.
And I believe that there was a $500 elderly refund on taxes and it's gone to 1,000. Is that correct?
That was voted in last year, and we've implemented that for the first round of exemptions that were applied for in fiscal year 2024.
Thank you. Chucky, do you have any
No, I'm good. Can I ask a follow-up
So-
question then?
quickly?
Well, questions take as long as they take, Jamie. I don't know that we're in a hurry. You just mentioned that we voted in a senior exemption.
To raise the senior, it was an
That's right.
existing exemption. for the-
That's not my question. My
Yeah.
question is that every exemption we put in increases everyone else's property taxes, including those on young families or anyone who's not a senior who pays for those exemptions. Isn't that true?
It's a statutory exemption. It's a program from.
I'm just saying.
From the DOR where we get reimbursed.
By increasing from 500 to 1,000, while I supported that and voted for it, the reality is that for anyone who is not a senior, we raised everyone else's taxes by increasing that overlay.
Well, we have to, it does come out of the overlay.
Yeah, that's what I
Yeah,
thought. Thank you.
yes, that's the only place that it can come from.
So at this time, Michael has finished his presentation and it is a hearing. And because it's a hearing, public comment can be had Each person can have 1.5 minutes for comment. They are not questions. We will not, as a board, answer them. If it needs to be germane and it needs not to be repeated by someone else. And only one person can speak at a time. And if anyone gets out of hand, they will be asked to leave the room. So I will start with hands. I don't know everyone in the room, but we'll one at a time. You may have, Michael Canales has offered to time people. And thank you for coming tonight and participating. Bruce?
Here or there?
Oh,
Either way,
Say
I think if you could come up and introduce yourself, because people may not know you.
My name is Bruce Auerbach. I live at 13 Interlake Crossroad. Thank you for the opportunity to make some comments. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to pare down my comments rather substantially given the 1.5 minute time frame. I'm going to focus on really two issues. One of them is that there has been talk about the need for the residential tax exemption to raise additional money for a variety of different things, including a new high school, and so on and so forth. And as Michael Blay mentioned, the residential tax exemption does nothing to actually increase the total amount of taxes that the town collects. And so there is no opportunity for residential tax exemption to provide any additional resources for a new high school or any other new services that the town wishes to provide. And I would also argue that the percentage of property taxes currently paid by part-time residents relative to services used, the part-time residents are already paying a disproportionate share of the town's expense budget. They are happy to do that because taxes are not a la carte, and sharing equitably in the expenses of the town and subsidizing services that they may not use is a demonstration of part-time residents' full-time commitment to the town. However, they should be appreciated for that subsidy and not told that they're not doing enough. That's a message the RTE sends. With respect to the issue of what it can the residential tax exemption do something to affect housing prices that would allow us to bring more middle-income families into the community? And the answer is no. There's nothing about the residential tax exemption that can do that. Lastly, the residential tax exemption can affect people that need help with their taxes that may be on fixed income or other financial constraints. But there are also part-time residents here that may have been here multi-generationally, that inherited homes that may have the same issue. And so we need to find a way through either means testing or something like that, rather than the broad brushstroke and the sledgehammer of a residential tax exemption. Thank you.
Anyone else have a comment?
George Hinckley, 18 Main Street, Taggart House. So like 10 years ago, I stood up at my first town meeting and said that we need to make more moves in this town to encourage young families and people that maybe can't afford these giant mansions. One of I own, I understand, but to move into town. And so if there's any way we can incentivize that, I didn't want to stand up 10 years later and say, I live in a town of only second homes and I have 2 young kids and there's no other kids to play with. Well, that's essentially where we are. We're actually considering moving as a result of it. But I think I'm in a class where my taxes will go up under the shift. I'm not exactly sure how it'll shift, but I'm residentially zoned, but we do have a B&B license that we keep for resale value in the future and whatnot. So I think our taxes will go up under the shift and we'll take more of the burden, but I still think it's a good idea. I'd like to see people on fixed incomes have the opportunity to continue to live in this town and not have to move out as a result of taxes being too high for them and they have to sell their houses, yeah, they may get a lot of money for their sale, but guess what? It'll probably be bought by another second home. So, thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes. Hi, Tom.
I'm Tom Pine and I live at 7 Rattlesnake Mountain Road. I also live at 18 Mackinac Shores Road. I am a full-time resident. I am also a second homeowner. I think this residential tax exemption is an idea. I think if the select board wanted to lower taxes, they could do that any time by cutting the budget, which would be very unpopular. And this simply lets you lower taxes on voters by shifting the money to people who can't vote and who can't. I don't have any say in the budget. And I think that's very unfair to a lot of our neighbors. My neighbors at Mackinac Shores, many of them are elderly, many of them are on fixed incomes. They're going to be affected, I think, as badly by this as the current full-time homeowners are by the high taxes. I just think we all want to have lower taxes, but I think this is not the way to do it by creating a second class of citizens in the town.
Thank you.
And it's not going to affect me one way or the other because my tax will go down on one house, they'll go up on the other.
Thank you. Anyone else in the room? Yes.
Hi, my name is Steve Averbush. I live at 36 Lake Drive. I recently moved to Stockbridge. First of all, my wife and I are very happy that we're here. We are now permanent residents of Stockbridge in Massachusetts. I stand in opposition to the implementation of a residential tax exemption, even though it may financially benefit me and my tax bill. Based on principle, the problem we're trying to solve is wealth disparity and value disparity. I heard in the presentation about shifting the burden. It should not be done on principle. It should not be done on the basis of residential status. It needs to be done on the basis of a value-based assessment or some other method by which we're trying to address wealth disparity. So on principle, I think that designating it by residential status is not the best approach to address problem of wealth disparity and the home value disparity that exists in our community.
Thank you. Anyone else from the floor? Nina?
Nina Ryan from 3 Main Street, and I hope we just keep this discussion open because I think that there are other possibilities, as the man before me suggested. But I think that we need to do something. So the residential tax exemption is one possibility, but it's happening all over the country that people are being priced out of their own houses in the towns that they have lived in and worked in. People who have made their lives in those, they have people who have not another place where they made their life. And so I think that it's important to recognize that there is a difference between residents and second homeowners, although I don't think that we have to be against each other. I think we have to help each other.
Thank you. Anyone on Zoom? Oh, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Ivy Cote, and I moved here about 20 years ago with my very young son after my husband passed away, and I work. I'm a teacher, and I'm working doing educational support at the middle school. And we've been renting, and I'm really hoping that I can buy a house in the near future. So every dollar counts to me because the salary that I make is, it's very minimal at the middle school. So just consider people like me who work full time every day at the school, and any break is great for us. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone on Zoom? I see someone in the corner and Anita.
Yes. Hi, Jamie. Thank you to everyone there. I'd just like to say, we go through this every year, and only the select board can approve it. We, as others have said, we'd like to keep our town with attract more full-time residents to our town, people with young families that can afford it. Why can't we try it with the minimal amount, the 10%? This is my suggestion. Try it, because next year you can vote it out or you could vote to increase it. But the only way you're going to see what impact it has is to try it. And obviously the state realizes there's a problem. They're trying to help us in the Berkshires to enable older people to stay in their homes through a tax decrease. It's shifting the burden, yes, but the second homeowners are second homeowners. They have a choice which one they want to be, their primary home or their secondary home. So it's not really discrimination, it's your choice. And I really recommend, I'd really like to see the select board try this for a year. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. And Joseph?
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. Look, I think there are two things going on here. One, the exemption just takes money from second homeowners or part-time residents, let's call them, and moves it to residents. It has nothing to do with who deserves it, who's old, who's young, who might move into town, who might not, who needs it, who doesn't need it, and therefore it is unfair. Second, what message do you think this sends to part-time residents who own properties in Stockbridge, and as someone else said, has maybe for generations owned that, maybe is not wealthy, and I can assure you that many part-time residents are not wealthy for a variety of reasons. And third, I thought last year there was a big presentation about other options available to support various groups who live in Stockbridge who might need aid. And one of them sticks in my mind, I'm not sure whether it was the circuit breaker or another one, where Patrick told us that the average income of a Stockbridge family was $46,000 or something like that. These are not, I may be wrong about the numbers, but that's what I remember. And that there was one exemption that came out that was available to families that earned $96,000 or less. And it was available to anybody on an income-based regime test that earned 96,000 or less. And if I'm right,
Joseph, you're done.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm done. I think that should be explored. It might work for everyone in Stockbridge who's not a part-time resident. Thank you.
Thank you. And I can't read her name.
Jane Carlin.
What is it?
Jane Carlin.
Jane?
Thank you for acknowledging me. In theory, I absolutely am in accord with the overriding housing challenges and what that means for individuals who are living here year round, whose incomes can't keep pace with the rising cost of et cetera. But the broad brush stroke makes so many cultural and socioeconomic assumptions that I find it offensive. I would much prefer more research on means testing and really determining a more fair way to apply an exemption. And then the last point I wanted to make is, in addition to supporting Joe Newberg's point about other sources of remediation, what about things like community foundations, creating more opportunities to give philanthropically to the fund that helps individuals in need? There are things we can do as a community that consolidate fundraising for fire department, police department, home ownership, that also provide tax advantages that we're not looking into. Thank you so much for letting us speak.
Thank you, Jane. And Patty Kaya?
Thank you. I'm here to vote, to raise against the residential tax exemption. The RTE applies a sweeping property tax increase based only on the perception of wealth, not any measure of it. And in turn, it provides tax relief without any determination of need. And ironically, we never flip the coin and look at the other side of this strange way of dividing the town's taxpayers. There are full-time residents who have more than one house. They too are part-time residents, just not here. But because they designate Stockbridge as the domicile, under the RTE, they would have their property taxes lowered. And in turn, there are part-time residents on fixed incomes living on Social Security, struggling to survive. And under the RTE, they would have their taxes raised. Not all part-time residents live in mansions. Determining property taxes based on anything other than property value is a judgment, not a policy, a sweeping generalization. And granting property tax relief based on anything but need is not progressive, it's folly. The perception of wealth is not a measure of it, and residency status is not an indicator of need. It's just another way to divide people along arbitrary lines. And if there's anything we've had enough of by 2024, it's divisions. Please vote no on this exemption. And I would like to thank Chuck and Jamie for your no votes in prior years. We really do appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Patty. Anyone else with a hand? Seeing none on Zoom. John Hart, you may speak. You have 1 minute and 30 seconds.
Now, I've told people that are on this board before, and I don't know how many of you in this room have ever heard this, but it's absolutely God's truth. And that is, my next door neighbor for many years was this woman named Beatrice Driscali. She was probably in her 80s when she called me one night, or one morning actually, and she had gotten her mail and the town had gone through its reassessment. And she was crying. And the reason she was crying and sobbing to me is, number one, I lived next door and plowed her driveway, but number two, because she got her tax bill and her tax bill had gone up $800 and she could not afford it. And I said, B, go down to town hall and see if there's any relief down there. And let me know what you find out. Well, she came back and she was still $400 short. And I ended up writing B. Driscali a check for that $400. And I would highly recommend that there are people in this room at least that have some compassion, for God's sakes, that should take this into consideration. And I urge the board to vote this down.
Thank you. And at this time, I'm going to close the hearing and we will make our votes. We will start with the first one being the motion to approve the residential factor of 1, which is in simple language what we have now, one single thing. Do I have a motion?
I'll make a motion.
Residence
Tax rate of 1.
Second? And I'll make a second. And a vote.
And are we going to not discuss each one?
Is there a need to?
Well, yeah, I think we should have conversation between the board now that, I mean, that's all right. You're the chair.
Carol, do you need to leave?
Beg your pardon?
Do you need to leave? You don't need to make fun of me. Thank you.
Jamie,
So-
no such thing was going on.
Patrick, would you like a discussion?
And the first thing we're voting on is the residential factor of 1, which is the residential of the commercial, correct? Yeah, no, I've got no discussion on this one.
Chuck?
No discussion.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second. Can we take a vote?
Aye. Chuck.
Aye.
Aye. So let's skip the second. Right? Yeah. Okay, a motion to adopt the RTE.
Do you want a motion or you want the discussion first? I would love to hear your thoughts.
You can have a discussion, you can say something.
First, I think we want to acknowledge, first I'd like to acknowledge how great it is to hear everyone's opinion today. These are hard decisions, and sometimes we have hard decisions before this board. And just speaking for myself, I can't speak for anyone else. Never are these decisions based on animus or division or negative feelings. I'm going to just run through a couple of points from how I see them. When Chuck and I and Jamie were in high school, we all went to Monument Mountain. There were 300 kids from Berkshire Hills, from Stockbridge in Berkshire Hills. Today, we have 100, of which 65 are in 7 through 12 and 31 are in 1 through 6. Okay? I asked a question, which was obviously rhetorical earlier to Michael. Why do you think the governor increased the residential exemption for 35 to 50% and included the Berkshires for the first time in a special designation for that additional rate? And I believe the answer is the lessons learned from the Cape, which is that it's become dysfunctional in so many ways. It's become incredibly difficult to hire firefighters and EMT workers and teachers and every other type of local job because of what's happened. It's nobody's fault what happened. It's just gotten really difficult to manage those communities. And what I believe these folks are suggesting to us is take a hard look at these hard decisions so that we have folks here in this town. We have the Red Lion Inn that flies workers in from Eastern Europe every summer to fill those jobs. When I was a kid, when we were kids, those jobs were held by all of us. They were competitive jobs. They were hard to get. Go talk to Once Upon a Table, Avi. She'd be open 7 days a week if she could. She can't find staff. We're gonna have to keep that balance of the families who provide the jobs that make the Berkshires run. And it's not animus. It's just the reality that we face. I would just finally point out that, I see Clarence is on this. The Eagle had an article just last week about the percentage of cash sales in this county. Most of the sales are cash sales in this town. That doesn't happen with first-time home buyers and young families buying the properties. It happens when there's too much competition for those properties to keep some people in place. I don't think we should just do the residential exemption. I think we should adopt every single thing we can to keep a balance of homeowners of different types and different stripes and different ages and different classes so that we can keep the Berkshires operating. We've seen this play out on the Cape. It is not great. And it's the purpose of this board. It's right in the manual. They give us a manual the day that we are elected. And it says your job is long-term strategic planning. All right. And sometimes that involves hard decisions like this one. And I respect if people come down on a different side. This is the side I've come down on. And with that, I'll make a motion that we adopt the residential exemption.
Do I hear a second? Not hearing a second, we'll move on. Motion to adopt the small commercial exemption. Do I hear a second or a motion?
No.
Okay, not hearing a motion to adopt the small commercial exemption, we'll keep it the same. And thank you all for coming to the meeting, and I appreciate
Thank you.
everyone's comments and motion to adjourn.
Second.
Thank you.